The Douglas Coleman Show is made possible with support from Seth David Radwell, a recent guest on the program and author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, released this past July. As Publishers Weekly writes in its recent glowing book life review of American Schism, business executive Radwell's epic debut examines the historical influences that have led to what he sees as the collapse of politics in the United States. Seth Radwell makes the case that the current chasm between the American right and left can be traced back to the 18th century's Age of Enlightenment and the basic tenets of liberty, equality, and reason. American Schism provides a historical perspective that can help us fight today's unreason with reason and bridge current-day divides. American Schism by Seth David Radwell is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold. For more information, go to AmericanSchismBook.com.
It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, A. Darius Kamali. Hello, how are you? Thank you for coming on the show.
Hi there, how are you?
Doing well. As we were just talking about before we got on, you are a filmmaker and you have written a couple of books now. So I want to get to your books in a second, but can you give us a quick backstory of how you got involved making films and maybe like why you wanted to do this instead of being a neurosurgeon or something else with your life?
Yeah, no, I could have gone either way. No, I'm kidding. But yes, my background is somewhat varied, you could say. It actually started off in human rights and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that were partially supported by the State Department. And from there, it transitioned to doing research on documentaries, usually human rights related. And then as my role grew, I found on the shows that the topic of the shows, the seriousness sort of decreased and they became more and more commercial. So I moved to Los Angeles and transitioned into television and documentaries. This is the early to mid 2000s, and worked on a number of shows, primarily History Channel, Discovery, PBS, Trio Network in England, so on and so forth. When you're in that world of television and documentaries, you're not necessarily working for the company itself, you're working for the show. And so it could be 6 months or 9 months and your role ends and then you're on to the next project. It's very up and down that way. And then I transitioned to feature animation. I was a producer on a film called Igor with Jay Leno, John Cusack, Eddie Izzard, a number of stars. We were the first independent, actually, that was able to produce and get distributed a feature-length animated feature film. That was 2008 through MGM and the Weinsteins. And so that was, quite a stroke of luck in a sense, and we've done a couple since then for both Netflix and Amazon Prime. Again, animation, and it's an interesting model where, a lot of the work is done overseas and comes back here for post, and the music could be done in Eastern Europe. It's very, globalized these days.
It's amazing how stuff can be put together. I know from people I've interviewed and just general experience with filmmakers that it can be done all over. You could have a bit done over here, a bit done there, and then it's all put together. Yeah.
Yeah, not only can, but it is done that way as the norm now. In fact, we have on the animation side partners out of China, out of India. To give you an example on Igor, for the score, we hired an orchestra out of Eastern Europe because it was so much less expensive, and they're some of the world's best musicians.
Oh yeah.
And in fact, as an independent, it's sort of the only way you can do it for the budgets that we have. All right, because it's so much cheaper. Of course, you better know who you're working with, and they better have a track record, because if something goes wrong, am I going to go to India and try to sue them? Forget it.
I'll try to find them.
Yeah, even find them. Right? So
good luck.
It's complicated. And so even prior to COVID, our industry was used to being very virtual. And of course, with COVID, basically every industry that can be virtual has gone that way anyway. So it's not anything new to anyone anymore.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I was mentioning to you that my producer and I work remotely, but we started doing that a long time ago. We started back in like 2009, 2010, and long before COVID. And it just worked out that way. But it's great. It allows people to sort of stay where they are. I'm originally from Boston, and I moved to Vegas in 2005, and he stayed. We've been friends since high school, him and I. And,
that's a big change.
Yeah, and so he stayed there, and I moved, and I said, well, we can work remotely. It doesn't really matter. But back then, not that many people were doing it. But now it's sort of like everybody's doing it. So I think it's wonderful. I'm hopeful that all of this sort of global interaction with people is going to, I hate to sound corny, but, sort of unite the world and be it our path to world peace. However, it seems like it's having just the opposite effect. And I noticed in one of your books, I guess it's the dog whistling Dixie,
past the graveyard.
That's kind of a mouthful.
A very short title.
But you're hitting on the topic of political identity and self-identity. Is that correct? Yeah, that's right. It's they weren't. Neither of these were meant to be strictly political polemic, but they did end up sort of going that way simply because everything is political in a sense these days. You can't separate these things. It's really about identity, and to the extent that identity influences our politics, right? So it's interesting what you said, that one would think that the internet would unite us all. But in fact, it certainly has that potential, and in some ways it is doing that. But at the same time, again, even the internet has become corporatized in a way, right? And so not only on social media are we blocking out people who don't agree with us more and more, to the point where after a few months of being on a Facebook or a Twitter or an Instagram, whatever kids are using the TikTok these days, pretty soon everyone in your circle agrees with you, and you think that that's the universe. And so the potential of being introduced to actually new or contrary ideas is there, but one has to actively seek it out, right? That's a good point.
And, even for example with Google, where you would think, well, this is not social media, it's a search engine. I worked for a search engine briefly some years back called Oingo, that sold itself as a technology to Google before Google had become the norm. It was still a free-for-all. But even with Google, as you probably know, when you do a search, even if you use the exact same spelling, same words as I do, we're not going to get the same top results. You'll have, based on what they think that your search history has been in the past, what you're interested in, your top results are going to be different than mine. And that's a problem for civilization in the sense, unless you really dig in and go to page 17 yourself, people are going to get a different version of the world based on what these corporations think you want to see.
Yeah, right? It's not funny, but it is funny. I can give you an example of that we were talking about on a previous show, and sorry, I can't remember the name of the guest, but we were talking about this exact thing, that Google has become sort of weaponized. And as the example, they typed in Donald Trump, just the name. Okay. Now, depending on where you had been in the past 6 months, if you were a pro-Trump supporter or an anti-Trump hater, you would get all of the positive stuff about Trump if you were a supporter. But if you weren't, you'd get all of the like, oh, isn't he awful? He did this, he said that, all his mean tweets, everything that was wrong with the guy would come up.
Yeah,
but on the other side, everything
self-supporting.
Right. And it was just amazing to see that because, like you said, you know, you should be able to type something in and get everything, but you don't unless you really dig in.
Right. Or at least get the same as others do in a random fashion.
In a random fashion,
but that's not how it is.
It's all tailored.
They're essentially feeding you what you want to hear. And I understand why they're doing it. It's because it's a corporate model. It works for advertising.
It does.
If they're trying to find out what product you want to buy, they're going to push you something similar to that product. But for civilization and culture, it's like a death knell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And when you put that in perspective, it's not just the internet. The internet has emphasized this, of course, but look at our traditional media, cable news. If you're watching Fox News versus MSNBC or CNN, you're getting different realities fed to you.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say I'm not picking sides. I think that it's sort of good cop, bad cop in a sense to begin with. But if that's all you're getting, it's no wonder that after a while, I sometimes say, I'm half kidding, but half not kidding, that if you're not crazy to begin with, after watching these cable news shows long enough, you will be, because they're just feeding you, red meat for one side or the other, whatever happens to fit that narrative. And they may not be factually incorrect, but if they're just giving you information that fits that narrative and only that information, then it's rotting your brain in a way. And so even though the potential, as you were mentioning at the beginning, of the internet is still there, I think without people individually using critical thinking skills. Look, on the internet, for example, not only MSNBC and Fox News, we have access to every country's media. But how many of us are actually tuning in? Very few. And most people are still being distracted by what the Romans called bread and circus, right?
Well, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. And I think actually there is this sort of myth that people have bought into that the computer is the brain, when in fact all it is a tool, and you still have to use your own brain to make decisions.
Very good point.
And I think people have fallen into this sort of pit of laziness that they think, oh, well, I'll just Google something and everything will come up. I don't have to think about it. But the problem is, again, going back to this idea of weaponized, that in fact they know that, and they're playing on the Google people, and then they're using that to their advantage. Yeah,
they know very well.
They know very
what
well
they're doing, and and not only that, but everything that you're doing online, every search, whether you're using a VPN or not, or any of these sort of technologies, everything is there. For any hacker, any government, any corporation, any criminal that wants to get access to. It's just there's privacy. The concept of it is gone, right? Especially among the millennials and the next generation after the millennials, whatever they're called, Generation Y, I think.
I sort of feel bad because I'm a bit older, so I've seen the whole thing from back in the day. We were talking about news broadcasters, and honestly, I preferred Walter Cronkite, where you just sort of got the news at 6:00, half an hour's worth, and then you could just decide for yourself what you felt about it.
Right.
It was unbiased news.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, that they have to fill this time, right?
Right.
The 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, so what I have to do these days, because I'm used to the sort of Walter Cronkite style, is I have to go on about 4 different news outlets and read the same story. And then amongst the skews from all of these different news outlets, I can pretty much find the actual story somewhere in the middle of all of it. And it takes a lot of time.
Between the lines,
yeah, you have to read between the lines, and it takes a lot of time. It's frustrating, but that's where we're at these days. There's nothing really I can do about it.
Yeah. In fact, this is a good transition to, one of the sort of themes, I would say, of both of these books, Mistake of Identity and Dog Whistling, Dixie Past the Graveyard, it is very related to what you're talking about, but I think it's even deeper in a sense, because I think the issue isn't simply not having the time. The issue, again, goes back to identity, in the sense that we want to believe in a narrative, not necessarily because we have looked at all the different possibilities in a rational, dispassionate way and chosen ours. And that's why, no, it's usually based on where we grew up, right? So if someone says they're a Republican, it could be more to do with, the identity that they associate with, their geography. That if they say I'm a Christian, for example, that person may not have opened the Bible, but it's more an identity. People around me are Christians, so on and so forth. And to the extent that we all have that, and we all do, every nation has had it through not only human beings, but you can maybe even go back to, other species have it. It's maybe at a genetic level. It's in us.
Oh, yeah.
To the extent that we identify with a characteristic, an arbitrary, I would say, characteristic, such as race or gender or nationality, things that I call arbitrary simply because we didn't choose them, right? Then that sort of determines for us what narrative we feel like we should either follow or sometimes rebel against. That even that is, in a way, controlling us, right? If you feel like, I'm going to be the rebel and be against my own group, you're still being controlled by it in a way, in a negative sense.
Well, that's very true. And then now we've opened up a whole nother can of this with the idea of gender identity.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, that's a hot topic. To me, it's just another variation of a term that I define in Mistake of Identity as groupism, which is an inelegant term, but I think it captures all these other various subcategories, like racism, sexism, nationalism, where essentially what it is that when you identify your essential, fundamental sense of self with an arbitrary characteristic that's not chosen, that to me is already the beginning of the end. Even if it's positive, even if it's a positive identification, it's not a negative one. If the moment that I am more upset, let's say I'm a woman, and I am more upset about something that happens to another woman who I don't know than I am to a man who I don't know, that's already groupism. There's no once you go down that route, it's just musical chairs. You can no longer see the world as individuals. You're coloring it. You're tainting it with, is this part of my tribe or not? And that determines how you feel about it. And when you put it that way, everyone sort of gets it. It's almost a truism. And yet, we don't really act on it. We say America first, and they're not the only ones. Everyone says that about their own country. But, ultimately, if I don't know an individual in Milwaukee and I don't know another individual in Zimbabwe, all else being equal, why should they have different value? Now, putting aside that one of them might be a brain surgeon, the other one might be a serial killer, but all else being equal, assuming that they're, the same type of person. But so if you put it that way, people get it, but no one really acts on it. So there's a great schizophrenia going on in our culture between the concept of individual identity, the law being blind, for example, and group identity. And that, to me, unless that's addressed at a psychological level, then all the political shifting around that you can do is just akin to playing a game of, again, I say Mistake of Identity, it's like a game of musical chairs, and it's being played on the deck of a sinking Titanic. We're worried about what mask people are wearing, where the whole ship is sinking, folks.
Well,
we're in trouble here.
Yeah, that pretty much represents the United States, at least how I feel about it at this point. I think we're all going down, but we want to look as pretty as we possibly can on the top deck when the boat hits the water. And unfortunately, we may be closer to that than a lot of people want to admit. I mean, we've had a civil war, and maybe now we're having the uncivil one, right? I've heard that come up with several of my guests because I try to stay unbiased. That's one thing about my show that I'm proud of, is that I don't pigeonhole the show into a political hole. I stay away from politics, at least in the sense of espousing my own particular views. I like to have people from all walks of life talk about all different things, and I am just sort of the facilitator rather than, people are going to tune in for the guest, not for me. I don't like that idea where so many of the shows that are out there now, the guests come on and the hosts just abuse them when they come on the show. I find that to be terribly tacky and just in bad taste, and I don't like it. Unfortunately, they're very popular, those shows. But it again
are popular because it's
a reflection of the society we live in.
It's a show.
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that. I would also add that if you look at, again, going back to cable news, for example, but really all news these days, when they have panels on, right? These are not panels that are diverse in thought. They may be diverse racially and in terms of gender, but their opinions are there to support the host, right? They are hand-selected. They are picked to push a certain narrative that's being pushed that day by the host. And this is, across the board. Right. And so I think it has a little bit to do with if you remember the fairness doctrine back in the 80s that was gotten rid of, I think under the Reagan administration. Not to get political about it, but that's when it happened. And it's gotten worse and worse since then, whereas there was at least some semblance of having to have multiple points of view on a show in the past. That's no longer the case. So it's become very ghettoized, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I keep fighting against that. I wrote a little pamphlet. I call it a pamphlet because it's only 23 pages, so I feel guilty calling it a book. The title of it is called Don't Do a Podcast. And it's sort of a satirical spoof on all of these people doing podcasts who really shouldn't be, even though they can. But
that would be a great name for a podcaster.
Yeah, don't do the podcast. But the point of it really is that everybody can get out there and do this thing. What happened to the diversity of thought? It totally got lost. People are just spewing their own personal opinions. I don't know. It makes me sort of sad because what happened? Did we get lazy? Was it Google that took over our brain?
I'll tell you what I think is that there's two types of diversity. Well, there's more than that, but at least two. And one of them is diversity of thought, as you just mentioned that term. And the other one is diversity of surface characteristics. And these two things have become conflated, unfortunately. And I am much more a believer in diversity of thought.
Oh, God, yes.
I would rather have that than just and of course, these things are related because if you come from a certain ethnic background or national background, certain geography, so on and so forth, you're going to have probably a different perspective. So they're not unrelated, but they're not exactly the same thing either, right? And too often we think, okay, if I have a representative of a certain class, of a certain race, or of a certain class, or of a certain gender, then, I've covered the bases. But to me, it's much more important to have the diversity of thought, regardless of what the person looks like. And we forget that, the African Americans are not of one opinion, and whites are not of one opinion, and Middle Easterns are not of one opinion. These are individuals, right? But they're presented in these packages, and it's really a game. It's for ratings, and it does a disservice to our culture and a disservice to our civilization.
Yeah, it sure does. And in just the year that I've been doing the video edition show, I've had people of all colors, sizes, shapes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and we didn't plan that. It just happened. These people just came through. And, we were so happy about it because it's like, look, that's the world. That's what's out there. We don't have to try to create that purposefully for some sort of photo op. It just happened.
Yeah.
And these people came through, and they had all different opinions about things, from the very radical left to the very far right, and everybody in between. Most of the people were pretty much kind of right down the center. And Seth Radwell, who's one of our sponsors, he has a book out called American Schism. He calls those people the exhausted majority. And I think that's brilliant because I think that's where a lot of people in this country are right now. They're just tired of it. Yeah.
I'll tell you, what you said reminded me of something that I also addressed in Mistake of Identity. I come from a film background and as a producer. I know that Hollywood has sort of lost its mind for the last few years, trying to keep up with, the right verbiage and identity politics sort of gone mad in a sense.
Pronouns.
And I understand where it comes from, because there was a lack of diversity and did have certain agendas, and Hollywood always has had all of those things. And it's now trying to make up for it, but I don't think it's doing it the right way. And so my theory was that, why can't we have a movie where anyone can play any role? That literally a black person can play a white role. It's acting, isn't it? The whole point of it is to be able to put yourself into the position of a character that's different from you.
Well, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And people, some people got it and others thought, well, that's ridiculous. And but I think that actually would go a long way in kind of diffusing this notion that we are our surface identity. It will sort of, and there have been, shows who have done this especially in theater. This has happened before, but it's certainly not the norm, and not in Hollywood. Not only that, it would solve the problem of, are there enough roles for a certain group? Well, if anyone can play any role, that problem goes away. It's just based on your ability to act now.
I would push back on that idea in just the way that it has been done in the past. I mean, you can go all the way back to Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer. He was playing a different race, but he did it in sort of a demeaning, derogatory way. Asians have been portrayed like that by white actors in various films.
That's a whole other thing. Now we're talking about someone mocking someone, right? That's,
well, exactly. But I think people are going to be hypersensitive to that.
Yeah. No, I understand. But I mean, I think the intent behind it is all the difference, right? So, someone playing remember Tootsie, for example, Dustin Hoffman in the early 80s. Right. I'm old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
That was a feminist film in a way. He wasn't mocking a woman, but there are other films where a male playing it depends on the intent. That's what I would say. And so, again, my concept here is that we should try our best, even if we're not entirely successful, because it's so even genetically ingrained in us, to overcome our need to identify with the surface characteristic, right? Even if we're not entirely successful. So, for example, I say that we may never be entirely successful in overcoming violence or crime, but at least as a society, we have come to a point where we have determined that those are bad things, right? And then we use our different institutions, whether it's law or education or religion or the family, to fight against this internal instinct. Well, I think the same thing, we need to get to the point where we begin to see that identifying too strongly with a surface characteristic that is not chosen is not the best way to go. And if you don't solve that, then all the political posturing in the world will only again be changing masks. Again, I'm not sure whether it's a mistake of identity or dog whistling that I make this point, but I don't know if you're aware, but the word person in the English language goes back to Latin and to Greek ultimately, and it comes from personae, which was the word for mask, literally the mask that an actor would wear on stage.
Oh, that's interesting.
And isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
From a psychological perspective? But we've sort of forgotten, and don't get me wrong, I am all for playing the identity game, but I would say that we need to know, I need to know that you know that I know that ultimately it is a game, and I think we've forgotten that. And the solution that I propose, I throw out there, is something that we already are quite used to. It's sports. It's the solution from sports. In our culture, we're sports fanatics, both as athletes and as viewers of sports. And so we're used to Kobe Bryant, the late great Kobe Bryant, being a Laker and getting all the benefits being a Laker, the being part of the team and giving his all for that team and so on and so forth. But the next day, he knows that he could be traded to the Chicago Bulls. or the Dallas Cowboys, in football, be traded to a different team. And no one takes it so seriously. The athletes get all the benefits of being a part of a team, and the fans do, but they don't take it so seriously as to forget that that's not their primary, their essential identity, that it's just a game, right? But we have forgotten that when it comes to these other things, such as race or nationality. We've forgotten that those are also arbitrary characteristics that are unchosen. I would have more, if I can just add this to it, more respect and understanding of a difference if it's consciously chosen. So an ideology, for example, that you consciously choose, that's perfectly legitimate to me. If as an adult you've studied various ideologies and you pick this one and I pick that one, you become a communist and I become a capitalist, well, that's perfectly valid. You've chosen that. The kind that I'm terming as groupism are the ones that are unchosen.
Oh, I
like
see.
Race,
Okay.
like geography, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, what I find interesting about that is that our First Amendment in the United States guarantees the right to freedom of religion. And religion is a chosen concept.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. To some extent. And in fact, I address this in the book. I think there's a big difference between going after someone based on race. I think that's totally illegitimate, right? Because I didn't choose it. And it makes no sense. It's silly and it's immoral. But going after a religion, I actually don't have a problem with. And I know this is very controversial, so long as we don't conflate the person with the ideology. I think religion is an ideology, a set of beliefs that you choose, and it should be susceptible and open to criticism and critique, just like any other idea, just like a secular idea. And the notion that just because you have faith in it, or it was written in a book by some, Bronze Age tribe in the Middle East 5,000 years ago, then no one has the right to challenge it. That's absurd. It's an idea like any other idea.
Yeah.
Now, where it gets conflated is that we shouldn't attack the person, of course, but can we attack the idea? Can we challenge the idea, debate the idea? Absolutely.
Of course we can.
Religions are ideas just like secular ideas, and should be completely open to debate, to challenge, and even mockery.
I agree. One of your talking points that I wanted to bring up and just tell you a little story of mine, a personal life. It says the dangers of groupism. And this is going back to 2007. In 2007, I went to Thailand for 3 years and I worked as a teacher at a university in the rural area, not in Bangkok, but like 300 miles north in the middle of the rice fields. And I was there for 3 years teaching English at university level. So these were 18, 19, 20-year-olds. The most difficult thing that I had as an American wasn't the language barrier, because I was there to teach English, so all the classes were in English. But it was this idea of collectivism versus individualism. Now, the society, the Thais, and I think Asians generally speaking, are much more of a collective group. In other words, they don't really value the idea of individualism. You're only as good as the weakest link in the chain. And there was a proverb that I learned while I was there, which was that the Westerner can be defined as the early bird catches the worm, meaning be the first one, be the best one, and you will get the reward. And in Asian culture, their same saying was that the nail that sticks up gets hammered in. And I found that to be really fascinating. So my point here that I'm laboring to get to is that the kids that I was teaching, the hardest thing to get them to do was to think outside the box. Because when I would point to one and have them stand up to give an answer to some question, the first thing they would do was look at the person sitting next to them every single time. And it drove me nuts because I thought, what is wrong with these people? Why do they have to, aside from the fact that at university they're required to wear school uniforms, like at a Catholic parochial school. So they all look the same. They're all dressed the same.
That's right.
And yet...
And that's part of the point of uniforms, right?
Yeah. The irony here, and this is the end of this, the irony to me was that in this country, in Thailand, the religion is Buddhism. And Buddhism is a very individualistic type of religion. It's not an organized, it's like, here it is, here's the book. Buddha talks about, it's all about you. You have to figure this out for yourself. I'm not a preacher. I'm going to give you ideas, and it says here, step 1, 2, 3, and this is the path to enlightenment. But it's up to you to find it, okay? On the other hand, us in the West, who are very individual thinkers, have Christianity as our primary religion, Judeo-Christian, which is a very organized, consolidated, preachy type of a religion, where it says, you shall do this, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. And I always thought that the religions were switched.
Individualistic.
And yet we're individualistic as a society. I always thought that the religions were put in the wrong societies, that Westerners should be Buddhists, and that the Asians should be Christians.
There's a lot there in what you just said. There's a lot to uncover piece by piece. No, that is actually a very ironic and clever insight. I would say the reason for that, is that Christianity is essentially not Western. Christianity comes from the Middle East. Christianity comes from Judaism and to an extent Zoroastrianism, which actually is Indo-European, so it gets complicated. But it was
adopted by the Western mind.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
I said it was adopted by the Westerners. I think the Romans first.
Europe doesn't like to think of itself as colonized, but it was colonized by an Abrahamic religion.
Right.
Europe's religions were the Greco-Roman pagan religions, and the Norse religions, and the Celtic religions, the Indo-European religions, and they were very, very different. And although, they've had some influence on Christianity, by and large, Europe was colonized by Middle Eastern religion.
True.
And so that kind of explains to some extent historically that dichotomy between the West is still to some extent Greco-Roman, that sense of the individual, but there's this Middle Eastern religion overlaid on top of it. It's a hybrid, like most cultures now, today. Yeah. It has many, many different layers that have come to it from different directions in different eras, right? And I totally agree with you in the East that Buddhism, in fact, it's funny that you should mention Buddhism. On the cover of my book, Mistake of Identity, is a symbol, the symbol that's used in Buddhism and Hinduism, known as Atman. Essentially, what that represents is a concept very similar to what maybe in Western psychology we would term as collective unconscious in Jungian sense, right? It's very similar. Of course, they're coming from different cultures, and one is scientific and the other one is spiritual, but essentially I think they're talking about the same thing, which is that primary sense of self that possesses the other ones. And what do I mean by that? Even in our language, if I can take a moment with this, we tend to intuitively know this. When we say, I have a body, we don't say grammatically, I am a body. We say, I have a body, which implies that there's an I separate from the body that possesses the body, right? We also say, I have a brain, which implies that we know that we're not the brain, that there's something that possesses the brain. It gets even weirder when we say, I have a mind. Well, who is this I that has the mind if it's not the mind itself? Well, that I that has the mind is exactly the same in you as it is in me, according to this concept of Atman, right? So that is what I would say is the fundamental self. And I'm not at all against variation. I think it's the spice of life. It's the way evolution works. But we need to kind of have that twinkle in the eye that even though you believe this, I believe that, you were born there, I was born here, ultimately the subjectiveness that has all these experiences is exactly the same in you, exact in a geometric sense, in a axiomatic sense, as it is in me.
I'm sorry, imagine using that line in an argument. When you're having an argument with your significant other or your boss or somebody who has put you down for some, task that you did or didn't do or whatever. And rather than saying, well, I have a brain, you say, I am a brain.
I am a brain.
You imagine how arrogant they would think you'd come off if you said something like that?
Yeah, well, that has a different implication that I'm smarter than you.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
By the twist of one word, it changes the whole meaning of that sentence. But.
Absolutely, it sure does. Yeah, it can get you in deep trouble. But yeah, I didn't mean it in that sense, but yeah, it can be interpreted. And you also mentioned, the difference between Asian cultures, and you sort of caught yourself like that's a generalization. But I want to make the point. I make this point in the book, in both books, in fact, as well, that generalizations are a little, underrated. They tend to be generally true. It's just that the problem is when we, generalizations tend to have at least grains of truth. The problem is when we forget that they're generalizations. So they're not entirely in an effort to counter our propensity to generalize too much. There's been a counter reaction to them, as if no generalization can possibly have any element of truth, and that's not true either. It's folk wisdom sometimes has a lot of at least grains of truth within it, as long as we don't get caught up again and think that it must apply to every individual in that group. No. But if you take it generally, I think you're absolutely right that at least parts of Asian culture are more group-oriented, and Western culture, at least in the Greco-Roman sense, before Christianity, was much more individual-oriented. And both of these are legitimate ways of approaching life, right?
Exactly.
But
let me just cut in here for a second, because the one thing that is different is the United States. And having lived abroad for several years and have traveled around the world, there is a much more collective mindset in homogenous countries, where it's one race, one religion of people that dominate the country. Okay, in our country, in the United States, we're made up of everybody. Everybody came from somewhere else.
Everyone,
yeah, even the natives, the Native Americans. Scientifically, they've proven.
They're Americans.
Well, they came from Asia. They migrated over the land bridge 5,000 years ago. Right. So
the Bering Sea there.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So everybody came from somewhere else. Okay. It's just, people get uppity about who got there first. But be that as it may. Right. So in the United States, it's a little bit more of a sensitive issue, because what people tend to do, or did, was that they would generalize people based on their surface appearance, like race, and they would always generalize them back to wherever it was that they came from. And that's wrong.
Right.
And I'll give you a quick example of this, and it was related to the Family Feud television program that Steve Harvey is doing now from Africa. I don't know if you've seen any of those episodes on YouTube.
I haven't seen the new ones. I remember that show from way back. This will date me, but from when it was
Richard
Dawson. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, Steve, just to be quick, Steve Harvey does a version of the show now from Africa. Okay. And what I found kind of pathetic, but interesting anyways, because it makes a social statement of how the groupthink is in this country, is that he is a black man. He is an African American, but he is an American African first.
That's right.
Now, when he's gotten on that show, and especially the earlier shows, he was having more difficulty communicating with the other black people on the show. And yet the white Africans, the white South Africans, and the black South Africans had no issue. They knew exactly what each other were thinking. Okay. So when he started
That's
to
right.
make all of these, hey, bro, and kind of, we're akin because of our skin color, I was like, no, buddy.
And they're like, who are you?
And they're like, who are you? They did not buy it at all. Okay.
Right.
But because he came from here with this sort of political correctness, ingrained in his think, and it didn't work over there. It didn't work at all.
Yeah. We've gone sort of crazy with the political correctness here. It's the notion that the problem that I have many problems with it, but one of them is that we seem to imagine that the particular caste system that's been problematic in the United States is exactly how it is everywhere. That's not the case.
Oh, no.
Here it's been, whites oppressing blacks historically. Of course, that's absolutely true historically. That's not the case somewhere else. In Africa, you have the Tutsis oppressing the Hutus. In India, you have the northern Indians oppressing the southern ones. The Aryans versus the Dravidians, the Muslims versus the Hindus, and you could go on and on for every country or any era that you look at. And I think the lesson from that is not to get too tied up in the specifics, but notice the pattern there of what's happening, right?
One oppresses
because if
the
you
other.
imagine that the problem is white people or black people or Jews or this or that, whatever the case may be, you're missing the point. The problem is even identifying with any of those things as your primary identity. That's the problem. Once you do that, then it's downhill from there.
Yeah, it's insane. Let me tell you another quick story about that. I have a feeling I'm going to have you back on the show for part 2, and we'll just do a 2-hour show. But let's carry on. We've got another
I'll be here. Yeah,
13 minutes or so. While I was in Thailand, I met another American who was working at the university. He happened to be Chinese American, of Chinese descent, but he was born in San Francisco five generations ago, Anyways, he left Thailand and he went to China to teach English. He got an opportunity to go to China, mainland China, and teach. So he went. We kept in touch by email. He told me a funny story. He got there. There were some other foreign teachers there who were teaching. One of them was a British guy, Caucasian, white guy, who spoke fluent Mandarin. Now, Kevin, my Asian American friend, did not speak a word of Chinese, of Mandarin. The two of them, the British guy and him, went to a restaurant or a cafe in the little village where they were teaching. They sat down, the waitress came over, and the Caucasian guy did all the ordering in Mandarin. And while he was ordering, the waitress was giving Kevin the stink eye because she was looking at him like, what's wrong with you? You look like us. Why don't you speak? And that was the take that he got. And he said he felt so, I don't know, demeaned or, he wanted to crawl under the table.
Do you think she felt that he was doing it on purpose, that he was hiding, or she just couldn't comprehend?
I don't know exactly what she was thinking, other than she was not amused that she had to listen to a white man, a guaylo, spouting in Mandarin while the Asian guy wasn't speaking at all. So either he was being uppity or something, but she was not amused, was the point.
Yeah, you're one of us, and maybe you're trying to pass yourself off as one of them, like you're above us. That could
something
very well
like
be.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you see, doesn't this go to show that, in this sense anyway, the cultural difference really is stronger?
Absolutely.
It overrides the ethnic or racial difference.
Yes.
Also going back to your previous story that you just told, Americans, when they go abroad, the term that I hate, the ugly American.
But it's true.
All the time.
It's true. Yeah. I've seen it over and over.
But ugly or not, the point is that they can pick us out in a moment, and we can pick ourselves out. I have a similar story. Actually, it's a story that a friend of mine told, but I'll try to tell it. He's a Caucasian American, and he was in the Air Force, I believe, and he was stationed in Japan. And he said that, and this was a while back, so maybe at that point there weren't that many Americans in Tokyo, but when he would, his eyes would meet another Caucasian in the crowd. They would look at each other and sort of smile, like, you know that I know that, we're one. It's a really bizarre thing. And of course, they may have been from entirely different cultures.
Right. Well, that happened in Thailand with me too. I mean, if I went to the local shopping mall and I saw another Caucasian, there would be this kind of eye contact, and it is there. Not with every single one, but sometimes.
I think it's so strong. It's so ingrained in us that I don't actually believe, don't get me wrong on this, I'm not advocating for an adoption of a homogenous sense of, no, not at all. I don't think that's possible. I think we differentiate. I think it's biologically necessary, even from an evolutionary psychology perspective. It predates humans. It predates primates. If you look at any species, they're differentiating themselves and identifying with a group which defines itself against other groups based on something. That's part of evolution, you could say. So all I am saying is that we need to sort of use its weight against itself in a sort of mental judo, because it can't take it on head on. It's too strong. And play the groupist game, but at the same time, just like we do in sports, realize that it's not our fundamental self, right? And that's a psychologically tricky thing to do. But unless we at least advocate for that through our institutions and try to teach color blindness, even if it doesn't fully work, just like we teach against violence, even though that doesn't fully work, then all the political shenanigans in the world will not actually change the number of people who are downtrodden and the number of people on top. It'll just be a different group, but it'll be the same number. And from a utilitarian perspective, what difference have you made? Right?
That's true.
It's just now it's the people with the blue mask on top and the people with the red mask. Well, is that really progress?
We've just changed the color.
Why don't we? Yeah, or just change the color, right? Or if you're using the musical chairs analogy, why don't we just add more chairs instead of fighting over who gets to stand next time around? So that should be the solution. But of course, politicians use groupism all the time in order to basically trick people into thinking something's being done or set them against each other, while a very small minority of rich people, robs us all blind.
Well, what about the idea of just getting rid of the political parties in this country?
That's different. I mean, that you can make that argument, and that's a separate argument. But here's where I would say that's not the same as what I'm talking about, because political parties, again, ideally anyway, are an ideology presumably chosen, and so that's fairly legitimate. Now, I understand that that's not in reality how it works. In reality, sometimes most people, I would say, choose their political party based on identity. It's based on your geography or your race or your ethnicity, so on and so forth. So, yeah, it's problematic. But at least ideally, it should be something that's a chosen ideology, and I have no problem with that. It's when it gets conflated with these arbitrary characteristics that it becomes problematic.
Well,
you're a Republican because you're a white guy, or you're a Democrat because you're a black guy. That's when it becomes problematic.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So that's my point, is that if we eliminate the party, it eliminates that problem, at least in that sense, because then people can't latch on to it. The Biden made that famous statement to, I forget his name, but he said, "Oh, if you vote for Trump, you ain't black." And I think he was kidding when he said it.
Yes, he did say that, didn't he?
Yeah. But, even if he was kidding, it wasn't a very good thing to say, because it sort of peeled back that layer of bigotry.
Of course, no, it's a totally racist and groupist thing to say. It's assuming that based on your race, then you have to have a certain ideology, and that's
which is
obviously
totally
ridiculous.
Wrong.
Yeah. I wouldn't go so far as to say that getting rid of the party solves the problem. I would say, I know what you're trying to do, and I agree with your where you're trying to go. Right? I think you have to get even deeper with it, and you have to address it on an individual psychological level, where people start to see themselves fundamentally as people. Trying to get rid of all the harms out there in the world is not going to work. But if you teach someone critical thinking, they're better equipped to deal with everything out there, right? There's no way for us to change what Google's going to do, change what Facebook's going to do, what governments and corporations are doing to us. We can. It's sort of like tilting at windmills, as they say, right? But if you teach people from an earlier age, and this is something that I'm a big advocate for, critical thinking. It's still not a perfect solution because we are emotional beings, and our logic has very little influence over us compared to our emotions, unfortunately. But if you at least give them the tools of how to formulate a valid argument, what constitutes a sound or a valid argument, what are the basic fallacies, the fallacies that everyone falls for every day, 100 times a day in advertising and politics. But they don't teach you that unless you take philosophy in college, right? Or, you become a law student. They don't teach it in high school. Let's go some of the best private schools, maybe. Certainly not in public schools. And I think some level of that needs to be taught from an early age. But of course, the powers that be don't want that, right? They don't want critical thinkers. They want someone to essentially mindlessly obey and be manipulated as easily as possible. So that's the problem.
Hear, hear. And I think on that note, that's the one we're going to wrap up on. Thank you so much for coming on. Give your website, please, where people can find the books and find out a little bit more about you.
Sure. My website is simply my name, DariusKamali.com. Kamali is K-A-M, as in Michael, A-L-I. And the books are available on Amazon.com, Mistake of Identity, and Dog Whistling Dixie Past the Graveyard, both on Amazon.
Super. Thanks so much for coming on. And we'll probably have
Thank you
back
for having me.
in another couple months, and we'll pick this up because this is one that
I would love that.
We could do a whole mini-series.
Well, I'm up for it. I would love that.
All right.